A Wandering Crow, the story of Master Bashō.
Yoru hisoka ni, mushi wa gekka no kuri o ugatsu. Night. Silently, in the moonlight, a worm digs into a chestnut.
300 years ago saw the death of Matsuo Bashō, the great Japanese poet who brought the haiku verse form to a state approaching perfection. For the next half hour, Chris Nicholson tells the story of Bashō's life and of his search for spiritual enlightenment, with help from the poet and translator Stephen Gill, the travel writer Lesley Downer, the critic and biographer Professor Makoto Ueda of Stanford University in California, and also from Bashō himself.
In this mortal frame of mine, which is made of 100 bones and 9 orifices, there is something. And this something, for want of a better name, is called a wind-swept spirit, because it is much like a thin drapery that is torn away at the slightest stir of the wind. This something in me took to writing poetry many years ago, at first merely to amuse itself, but finally to making it its lifelong business. It must be admitted, however, that ever since this spirit began to write poetry, it has never found peace with itself, always wavering between doubts of one kind or another.
I would say he was a rather gaunt-looking man. He probably had something of a beard, rather scraggy sort of looking beard. He seems always to have been depicted wearing the cap of a priest, and those shaggy, tattered sort of black robes, layer upon layer, that wandering priests wear in Japan. He would have had a staff, perhaps a knobbly bamboo staff, and he might well have had straw sandals on his feet, and perhaps a satchel around his neck in which he kept his paper and brush and ink.
Horo horo to yamabuki chiruka taki no oto. Petal by petal, yellow mountain roses fall. Sound of the rapids. Umi kurete, kamo no koe honoka ni shiroshi. The sea darkens. A wild duck's call, faintly white.
Bashō means banana plant, not the banana fruit, but the plant. And Bashō was called, first of all, Tosei. That was his poet's name. And when some of his followers planted a Bashō plant, a banana plant, outside his hermitage in Edo, old Tokyo, he so much liked this plant that he took the name.
The leaves of the Bashō tree are large enough to cover a harp. When they're wind-broken, they remind me of the injured tail of a phoenix, and when they're torn, they remind me of a green fan ripped by the wind. The big trunk of the tree is untouched by the axe, for it's utterly useless as building wood. I love the tree, however, for its very uselessness. I sit underneath it and enjoy the wind and rain that blow against it. Bashō no waki shite, tarai ni ame o kiku yokana. Banana plant in the autumn gale. The sound of rain pattering in the tub tonight.
In Japan, rooms are measured by the mat, by the straw tatami mat, and his hut must have been maybe 4.5 straw mats, which would have been 9 foot by 9 foot. And in the middle of that, he had a little table, and on it he had a grinding stone for grinding up his ink, which came in a block, and then he'd have a little bottle of water and a brush. And hanging on the wall was his raincoat made of straw, which looks a bit like a kind of portable haystack, and his hat also made of straw.
I think he was influenced enormously by the tradition of the Chinese recluse, the poets from the Tang dynasty onwards and even before, and the world of the literati in Japan at that time, the poet or painter, was one of the life of the recluse. So he was somebody who valued naturalness in all things, spontaneity, of course being in touch, completely, if possible, interpenetrated, at one with nature.
All who have achieved real excellence in any art possess one thing in common. That is, a mind to obey nature, to be at one with nature throughout the 4 seasons of the year. Whatever such a mind sees is a flower, and whatever such a mind dreams of is the moon.
Everything we know of Bashō suggests that he was a restless, romantic personality, one combining ambition and modesty in equal measure. He was born in 1644 in Ueno, some 200 miles west of what is now Tokyo, then Edo. His father was probably a farmer. At the age of 9, he entered the service of a young feudal lord, perhaps hoping that he would rise to become a samurai, a member of the ruling class. But when he was 23, his lord died, and Bashō's wandering life began. Details of the next 15 years are sketchy. At one point, he may have had a job with the Edo Waterworks Department. All the time, he was building a reputation as a skilled poet, with his work appearing in a number of anthologies. And by his late 30s, the time when he moved into his hut with a banana tree planted alongside, he seems to have been ready to devote himself full-time to writing.
He apparently was not a very tall man, a rather short man, and looked rather delicate. He was a little man. I think you would find him a pleasant man to have company at a party. But at the same time, I think when he went back home after meeting with you, he had some moody moments. He
芝の戸に茶を木の葉かく嵐かな
Against the brushwood gate, dead tea leaves swirl, stormy wind.
A haiku is a sort of little picture. Usually you have more than one image, 2 images usually, sometimes 3 images. But I think the images collide with each other, so to speak, or harmonize with each other. And I think each reader tries to come up with some kind of understanding of the connection between the two. That's why I think haiku is short, because it leaves room for the reader's imagination.
A haiku is a poem of 3 phrases. The first 5 syllables long, the second 7, the third 5, 17 syllables in all. Haiku were written as part of long sequences of linked verse, which members of the middle classes composed as elegant party games. Bashō, too, wrote for this purpose. His early haiku were conventionally witty, full of puns and wordplay. But by 1680, a more serious note began to sound, and it was this seriousness of purpose that transformed the haiku, elevating it into a verse form capable of expressing universal truths.
枯れ枝にカラスの止まりけり秋の暮れ
On a bare branch, a crow has alighted. Autumn evening.
I think Bashō himself, associated with the crow, I think when he donned the robes of a priest and wandered around Japan, he called himself Tabigarasu, which means a wandering crow. Self-deprecating sort of encapsulation of what he looked like with his black, shaggy robes and everyday sort of appearance. But the poem itself, it's got two images in it, hasn't it? It's got the crow and it's got the leafless branch there in the autumn dusk. And I think it's a poem which marks the beginning of a new period for Bashō, which was one in which he juxtaposed two images. And there's nothing in that poem to tell you how the poet felt. It's left to the reader or to the listener to decide what atmosphere is being evoked.
It was around this time that Bashō began to study Zen Buddhism under the guidance of a local priest by the name of Bashō. One day in the early 1680s, so the story goes, Bashō said to Bashō,
"How are you getting along these days?"
To which Bashō replied,
"After a recent rain, the moss has grown greener than ever."
What Buddhism is there prior to the greenness of moss?
A frog jumps into the water. Hear the sound.
On a spring day, Master Bashō was at his riverside hut in the north of Edo. Through the soft patter of rain came the throaty cooing of doves. There was a mild wind, and one or two petals of cherry blossom were falling gently to the ground. It was the kind of perfect day you sometimes have in late March. Now and then in the garden, he heard the sound of frogs jumping into the water. Our master was deep in thought, and finally came out with the last two parts of the poem.
買わず飛び込む水の音.
A frog jumps in. Water's sound.
Kikaku, one of the disciples sitting with him, immediately suggested for the first part of the poem, the mountain roses. Our master thought for a while, but finally decided on
古池や.
The old pond.
If I may offer an opinion, I think that although the mountain roses is picturesque and beautiful, our master's choice of the old pond, being simpler, contains more truth in it.
This little poem is the most celebrated in the Japanese language. Its simplicity and depth have posed all but insuperable problems for translators.
The old pond.
A frog jumps in.
Water's sound.
Age-old pond. Stillness.
Jump of a frog disturbs it.
With a little plop.
Pond.
Frog.
Plop.
It's been interpreted by the Japanese time and time and time again, every interpretation different. But in a way, the point of it is one moment of experience, this moment now, when the frog hits the pond and there's a splash. And that is, you are there at that second. And that's what Zen is about. I mean, Zen is about being in the here and now. It's like momentary, tiny experiences that somehow transform your perception of everyday life.
If you set it against the flow of time, I think this is one aspect of the greatness of Bashō. The feeling that Bashō is recording tiny little, seemingly insignificant moments of time, but in so doing, and in meditating on them, in thinking about them, and in bringing out the depth in those moments, somehow he's setting up a sort of monument against time. I think there's a feeling with Bashō's poetry particularly, it's not so in the case of most other haiku poets, that each poem, or most of the poems, are a sort of drop in the ocean of eternity.
A man named Sora has his temporary residence near my hut, so I often drop in at his place and he at mine. When I cook something to eat, he helps to feed the fire, and when I make tea at night, he breaks ice and draws water for me. He has become a most congenial friend of mine. One evening, after a snowfall, he dropped in for a visit, whereupon I wrote,
君、火を焚け。良きもの見せん。 Yukimaruge.
Will you start a fire? I'll show you something nice. A giant snowball.
The master said, learn about a pine tree from a pine tree, and about a bamboo stalk from a bamboo stalk. What he meant was that the poet should detach his mind from self and enter into the object, sharing its delicate life and its feelings. Your poetry issues of its own accord when you and the object have become one.
By now, Bashō was a famous poet, with disciples who hung on his every word, but he was far from settled. In the mid and late 1680s, he undertook a series of long, hazardous walks into the Japanese countryside.
Days and months are travelers of eternity. So are the years that pass by. Those who steer a boat across the sea or drive a horse over the earth till they succumb to the weight of years spend every minute of their lives traveling. There are a great number of ancients, too, who died on the road. I myself have been tempted for a long time by the cloud-moving wind, filled with a strong desire to wander.
I think he was trying to achieve a communion with nature. He wanted to get away from mundane world. He wanted to achieve a spiritual goal. And he thought that the best way to do this is to go on traveling particularly into wild nature.
The most ambitious of his walks came in 1689, when he and Sora set off for the mountains of northeastern Japan. An adventure he later wrote up in a highly poetic, magically beautiful journal, The Narrow Road to the Deep North.
For him, it was his last journey. He decided he was an old man. He was actually about 45, but in his terms, he was an old man. This was going to be his last journey. He gave away his hut. He had nothing to come back to. So he had nothing left in Edo, in Tokyo. So it was the last journey of his life, which made it very much some sort of, spiritual quest, some sort of personal quest.
It was early on the morning of March the 27th that I took to the road. My friends stood in a line and waved goodbye as long as they could see my back. I walked all through that day. By the evening, my bony shoulders were sore because of the load I had carried, which consisted of a paper coat to keep me warm at night, a light cotton gown to wear after the bath, scanty protection against the rain, writing equipment, and gifts from certain friends of mine.
It was the journey that the poet Saigyo, who was, as it were, a mentor of a few centuries before, had taken this same journey. The hero Yoshitsune had taken a similar journey in the opposite direction, in one of the great kind of historical sagas of Japanese literature. So this was the great romantic journey, maybe, in Japan. It's also to the particular part of Japan which it was the most remote, the poorest, the most unknown, therefore the most dangerous, therefore the most of a personal quest, the most of an adventure. And it was by far the longest journey he'd done. It was something like, I think, 800 miles on foot. So it was a very long journey.
I went to the Tada shrine, where I saw Lord Sanemori's helmet and a piece of brocaded cloth that he had worn under his armor. According to the legend, these were given to him by Lord Yoshitomo, while he was still in the service of the Minamoto. The helmet was certainly an extraordinary one, with an arabesque of gold chrysanthemums covering the visor and ear plate, a fiery dragon resting proudly on the crest, and two curved horns pointing to the sky.
Muzan yana. 兜の下のキリギリス
How piteous. Under the helmet. A cricket.
The principle underlying many of these poems was that of Sabi.
Our master told us, Sabi is in the color of a poem. It does not necessarily refer to the poem that describes a lonely scene. If a man goes to war wearing a stout armor, or to a party dressed up in gay clothes, and if this man happens to be an old man, there is something lonely about him. Sabi is something like that.
寂しさや岩に染み込むセミの声
Loneliness. Sinking into the rocks. A cicada's cry.
He thought it was very important that his poems should be light in the sense of not heavy, not kind of weighty and ponderous and boring, but kind of light in a Zen sense of just touching on something and moving off. I mean, it's very difficult to put this sort of thing into words, but there are lots of his poems which I think are very clearly humorous, I mean, which are funny poems. And he also liked to home in on what were very small little bits of everyday life. Not a big, ponderous event, but a small, tiny, tiny little thing.
道の辺のむくげは馬に食われけり
Blooming by the lane, a rose mallow, and it has been devoured by the horse.
山敷きて何やらゆかしすみれ草
Along the mountain road, somehow it tugs at my heart. A wild violet.
This delicacy of tone, or lightness of spirit, was to become increasingly important to Bashō in the years after his return from the deep north. He called it karumi, like looking at a sandy river with a shallow bed.
Karumi is simply an aesthetic which emphasizes lightness and clarity in a poem. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be comical or frivolous, but it shouldn't be obscure in any way. There's no need for poetic diction, for classical language, for depth of meaning as such.
うぐいすや餅に糞する縁の先
Bush warbler. A dropping on the rice cake at the veranda's edge.
木のもとに汁もなますも桜かな
Under the trees. Soup, fish salad, and everywhere, cherry blossoms.
Back in Edo, Bashō's followers built him a new hut and provided him with food and wine. Yet, nearing the age of 50, and despite the lightness of his poetry, his spirit was weighed down. In April 1693, a much-loved nephew died of tuberculosis in his hut, which saddened him greatly, and the peaceful life he wanted seemed to be eluding him.
The very fame that he had won had divorced him, if you like, from the position that he most wanted to be in, which was alone with nature or alone walking through the mountains writing poetry and pressing on towards a deeper idea of enlightenment in the Zen tradition. All this fame, all these meetings, this busyness, these poem parties, these expectations and everything were separating him from his real desire.
If someone comes to see me, I have to waste my words in vain. If I leave my house to visit others, I waste their time in vain. I have therefore decided to live in complete isolation. My solitude shall be my company, and my poverty my wealth.
朝顔や昼は上下ろす門の鍵
The morning glory. All day long, a bolt fastened on my gate.
Yet within a few months, early in 1694, Bashō was off on his travels again to meet and teach groups of poets in Western Japan about karumi, and his sense of dissatisfaction was as strong as ever.
he was a restless man, but I think that was primarily because he was an idealist pursuing goals that were beyond him. I think he always put his goals ahead of him, and whenever he attained one of those goals, he set up another goal that was higher than the one that he had before. I mean, I think it's a mark of any man who is trying to improve himself spiritually.
Bashō had never been physically robust, and these long journeys were tiring. Although he continued to write as vigorously as ever, his health was frail, and in October and November 1694, it finally gave way. Anxious disciples gathered round his bed. By November the 25th, he was near death. His appearance, according to one onlooker, like that of a bare tree standing by a rock in winter.
Late that night, I heard Master Bashō calling Donshu, who had been tending him. Then there was the sound of ink being prepared, and I wondered what message he had for us. It turned out to be this haiku.
旅に病んで夢は彼のを駆け巡る
On a journey, ailing, my dreams roam about on a withered moor.
Later, he reflected,
I know this is no occasion for writing a haiku, as I am faced with death. Yet poetry has been on my mind all through my life, which is now more than 50 years long. Whenever I sleep, I dream of hurrying along the road under the morning clouds or in the evening haze. And whenever I awaken, I am startled at the sound of a mountain stream or the cry of a wild bird. Buddha taught that all this was sinful attachment, and now I realize I am guilty of it. I wish I could forget all the haikai that I was involved with in my lifetime.
He said this regretfully, again and again.
I think he was a humorous man. I think he was much loved by his disciples and his followers, much admired. I think he probably had a kind of restlessness that he could maybe not satisfy. That was why he was leading a life which was different from the life that most people led at that time. So maybe there was some sort of yearning to find something. And whether he found it, I don't know.
手を打てば小玉にあくる夏の月
As I clap my hands, with the echoes, it begins to dawn. The summer moon.
稲妻や闇の片ゆく語彙の声
A flash of lightning. Passing through the darkness, a night heron's scream.
初雪や水仙の葉のたわむまで
The first snow, just enough to bend the daffodil leaves.
That was A Wandering Crow, the story of Master Bashō. Taking part were the poet and translator Stephen Gill, the travel writer Lesley Downer, and the critic Professor Makoto Ueda of Stanford University. The actors were Nigel Carrington, Togo Igawa, and David Holt. The program was written and presented by Chris Nicholson and produced by Molly Price-Owen.
Well, coming up next, we've a bulletin of world news, and that's followed as usual then by today's Words of Faith.